To produce 1 pound of coffee beans, farmers need to harvest more than 1,500 of these cherries. Each one contains 2 seeds that will be sorted, processed, and roasted before they reach your cup. In 2022, the average US price for a pound of coffee was $5.89. But there's a specialty category called single origin coffee that can easily cost over $30 per pound. Some exclusive harvests cost over $80 per pound. So what makes this coffee so special? And why is it so expensive? It's November in Nyeri County, Kenya, and the coffee harvest is in full swing. There are over 12.5 million coffee farms in the world. Almost 95% are owned by smallholders like Joseph. He runs a 1-acre farm, part of which he inherited from his parents.
Coffee is all about quality. If you produce coffee with a higher quality, the higher prices you get for your coffee.
Coffee grows differently depending on the altitude, climate, soil, and sun. Farms here sit around 1,700 meters above sea level in rich volcanic soil.
The coffee grows very slow, they take long time to mature, and the longer coffee takes time to mature, the better the quality. Almost everywhere, every farmer is growing coffee.
High-altitude coffee produces fruity and floral flavors. Drinking coffee brewed from beans exclusively from one region ensures that those distinct flavors come through. It's what's called single origin coffee. The quality and unique taste are the biggest reasons it can cost so much. But achieving that quality isn't easy. The terrain here is too uneven for machines, so farmers pick the coffee by hand, one cherry at a time. For coffee, ripeness is key.
Nashuna ile red, ile matured, nashuna ile imekomaa na ile ingine ninawasha. Lakini kwa muda wa wiki 2 ama 3 ile ingine imekomaa. Kwa wiki inaenda karibu 500.
Mary has been growing coffee for over 25 years.
Hii kahawa ni kuinherit kutoka kwa mbambu. Iko na miaka kama 50 something.
Each branch has ripe and unripe cherries, so she has to pay close attention while picking. The way coffee is harvested here in Kenya is very different from how it's done in Brazil, the world's largest coffee producer. On huge farms with flat terrain, the harvest is mechanized. The trees are at a lower elevation, and the yields are higher. Mechanized production is more efficient, but this efficiency can hurt quality control. When the whole tree is picked at once, ripe and unripe cherries are lumped together. This is commodity coffee, destined for mass production and industrial use. Its price is low and volatile. The highest quality coffee is called specialty coffee. This coffee has unique attributes that expert tasters, called Q graders, rate the highest. Single origin coffee is often rated at the highest end of specialty coffee because of its distinct flavours. Both specialty coffee and a lot of commodity coffee come from the same plant, Cofffee arabica, but not all Arabica coffee is created equal. This can of ground coffee is 100% Arabica. It costs around $8 a pound. In 2022, a single origin coffee grown in Panama sold for over $6,000 a pound at auction, also 100% Arabica. The better the flavour and the smaller the harvest, the more expensive the coffee. Back at Mary's farm, there's still work to be done. After harvesting, workers sort the cherries to weed out any defects. These negatively impact the flavour and lower the price of the coffee. But they need to work quickly. Processing coffee soon after harvest is key to maintaining its quality. Processing infrastructure is expensive, so most farms in Kenya share centralised facilities. Over 1,000 farmers from the region bring their coffee here. Each processing method has a different impact on taste, but they all have the same end goal: separate the seed from the fruit.
These are the 5 stages of coffee processing: the red cherry, the wet parchment, dry parchment, green coffee, and roasted coffee beans.
This is the washed process. It's the most common way to process coffee in Kenya. After weighing and inspecting the coffee, workers remove the outer skin in a process called depulping. Then they place it in fermentation tanks where it rests for 12 to 14 hours. Fermentation breaks down the mucilage, the sticky inner layer of the fruit, so it can be washed away. The next day, workers push coffee through a series of channels, cleaning off the seeds. This is also where one of several grading processes takes place. Workers separate lower quality, less dense beans, which float to the surface. Even though these beans sell for less, they still provide important income to producers. The denser coffee flows to soaking tanks to ensure any remaining mucilage is removed. Once the seed is free, the coffee flows out of the tanks and onto drying tables. Roasters sell coffee either as a blend of beans from different countries or as single origin. But there's no officially agreed upon definition of the term. It can refer to a farm, a cooperative, or a country. Consumers who buy this type of coffee are usually seeking a particular flavour or aroma. The costs of processing, transportation, and running a roasting business are all bundled into the price customers pay for coffee.
It's so expensive to get coffee here. Everything from the farm to the port, everything has gone up. The boxes where we ship your coffee for subscriptions or at home consumption, that packaging has gone up. With single origin, single producer, when you have the producer's name, it's an indicator that we paid more for that coffee because of the relationship. If you're paying in the range of $21 to $26, it's because we've invested in these areas that are important to us and we hope are important to them.
Companies like Metric play an important role in the coffee supply chain. Most coffee is consumed outside of the country it's produced in, and how coffee is roasted has a big impact on its taste. Getting the best flavour out of single origin coffee requires careful roasting. Coffee is roasted in big machines like this. Roasters take green coffee and heat it evenly to develop its flavour.
This is 20 pounds of Costa Rican honey processed coffee from Solis y Cordero, which is a husband and wife team in Terrazoo.
Hara uses sight, smell, and sensors to track how the roast is developing. Finding the ideal roast level for each coffee is a skill that takes years to master.
This tool that I'm using is called the Trier, and it allows us to see the color of the development as we go through the roast, and also to smell how the coffee is smelling. The green coffee will smell kind of like hay or grass. You'll smell it get sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. You can smell some of that acidity come out. It'll smell almost vinegary-ish. As soon as that vinegar starts to fade just a little bit and there's a sweet fruitiness and a sweet baked goodsness, that's our finished development.
Metric roasts coffee for an average of 11 minutes before Hara releases it into the cooling tray to stop the roasting process. By comparison, commodity coffee roasters favour a darker roast, which can cover up defects and make a blend of beans from different countries taste more uniform. While dark roasts are generally bitter, medium and light roasts offer more sweetness and bright acidity.
You can blast it for a minute, and a lot of commodity coffee is just blasted as quick as possible, but it really rushes through all of those phases that develop all of the flavors, going through those steps to get exactly the best qualities out of that coffee. We don't add anything to coffee. Everything was intrinsically there as the raw product from the farmer, from the growing conditions.
Light roasts also highlight the unique flavours of a region, allowing two single origin coffees to taste very different.
The tricky part about single origin versus blend is that you can achieve stellar results with blends and sometimes really subpar with single origin, and the same thing can be the other way around.
How a coffee is processed can have a big impact on its flavour and price. The washed process produces delicious coffee, but it's expensive and can be wasteful.
We use a lot of water, and there is a main challenge is how to dispose that wastewater. But we are trying to work on it by recycling the water we are using.
After spreading out the coffee, workers move it to a clean set of tables, where they continuously turn it by hand. This coffee takes around 14 days to reach a desired moisture content of 11 to 12%. The goal is uniform beans free of defects. Coffee at this stage is called parchment coffee because of the paper-like layer of material that surrounds the seed. Before producers ship the coffee, they mill it to remove the parchment. This is a small machine used for local consumption. When milling large quantities, the coffee goes through another round of grading. Each country has its own methods of grading. In Kenya, each bean is classified by size. The shape and colour of the bean also impact the grade, but often the larger, denser beans are the most expensive. After months of work, producers are left with what's called green coffee. This is the product that will be exported and roasted in consuming countries. But this is also when the process becomes more opaque. Farmers don't always know how much a buyer pays an exporter, so they don't know if they're being cut out of potential profit. The benchmark for the price of Arabica coffee follows what's called the C market. It's an exchange, like the stock market, where traders buy and sell contracts based on the expected future value of coffee. But it doesn't consider the quality of the coffee. And the price is volatile, which makes it hard for farmers to operate sustainably. In 2019, the average closing price was $1.02 per pound. Its lowest point that year, 87 cents. Despite inflation and increased cost of production, the C market is almost the same as it was in 1980. Joseph is able to operate profitably, but that isn't the case for many farmers around the world. A 2019 study found that 44% of smallholder coffee farmers were living in poverty. Specialty coffee is bought at a premium above the commodity price. Joseph makes around $3.18 a pound.
Due to the high quality of our coffee, there is a lot of demand. But our expectation is that the demand should go with higher prices.
He says $4.55 a pound would be more sustainable, but his prices have actually decreased over the past few years.
I don't know the reason why. Mostly we are told world market has flooded with coffee, but we still need more explanation on why the coffee is going down when we are still trying our best to maintain our quality coffee. For those who are producing less than 5 kilos from one tree, they are not even breaking even. The effort we make to produce that quality coffee, I can say we are not well compensated by those prices.
Growing coffee requires steep investments, which don't always pay off for farmers.
Kazi ya kahawa ni ngumu ukiwa hana pesa, lakini ukiwa na pesa si ngumu.
Many roasters in the industry are working towards direct trade partnerships that benefit the coffee producer.
I'm looking to do two things, source high quality coffees, but also establish year-over-year relationships.
Some roasters also publish the prices they pay for green coffee, but the level of transparency varies.
We as roasters need to do our job to educate consumers as to the difference between a product from Colombia that's sourced fairly, that's sourced with full transparency, and a product of Colombia that has no traceability and is cheap. If it's cheap coffee, that means that somebody in the supply chain is not making it, and chances are it's going to be the producer. They're the ones that lost.
At retail, Coffee from this region of Kenya has sold for $22.50 for a 12-ounce bag. That's over 9 times what the farmers are paid. But just comparing those two numbers doesn't tell the whole story. Even when producers are paid a premium, there will always be a markup between coffee cherries and roasted coffee. Roasters typically pay more for single origin coffee, but there's no definitive premium.
The real truth of it is that you can buy coffee at commodity pricing that actually meets specialty standards. For so long, the market has been so low and then the quality has been so high that producers need to sell their coffee. They need to earn a living, because if they're not earning enough to cover the cost of production, not earning enough to just meet the minimum requirements to have a decent way of life, they're going to be edged out. That is what's happening all over the world.
Many throughout the specialty coffee industry are working towards more transparency, better pay for producers, and more access to research and best practices. Ultimately, when coffee prices are low, the producers are the ones hurt the most.
I'm Rachel Peterson from Hacienda La Esmeralda. We're a coffee producers in the area of Boquete, Panama. We produce ultra specialty high altitude coffees, mostly of the geisha variety. In the auction, we put about 50 auction lots. Each auction lot has 300 pounds. The geisha variety has floral notes, it has a bright acidity, it has a lot of complexity, it has bergamot in the taste. It can have different types of flowers, ranging from jasmine, which is the most common, to things like roses, or a special fruit in Panama called pomarosa, which is very, very floral smelling. It has notes of stone fruit a lot of the time, but it can also have notes of tropical fruits like papaya or mango or even pineapple. We have one main farm, which is where we started out in coffee, and then we have bought additional farms in different areas close by that farm, but that have different microregions where the weather is a little bit different and affects the flavor, and it changes the final attributes in the cup that we end up offering, because in the end what we're really looking for is marked differences that stand out or that are very special to people in terms of aromatics and flavor profiles. My brother in 2003 decided to start cupping areas of the farm separately. That's when he discovered the geisha coffee, which until then had sort of been mixed in with other coffees in other regions. 2004 he put it in the Best of Panama, which is sort of the cup of excellence of Panama. It won first place by a lot. It was a very different coffee. We got first place again this year, we got first place 2 years ago, so it's tough, but we keep trying. So I just tasted the coffee that you roasted, and you have a beautiful, beautiful presentation. But mostly I was impressed by the flavor. You did a very good job on the roast. It had all of the attributes without being overpowering in any of them. So it's a very balanced coffee. You did a very nice job on it. I liked it very much. Very fruity, floral, nice acidity, clean, balanced, bright, everything you're looking for.
Today we're going to talk about roasting coffee. I'm going to cover what you, someone who buys, drinks and enjoys great coffee, needs or maybe even wants to know about what is a fascinating process. There's a lot to cover today. We'll start with the basics of how the roasting process impacts taste, and then we'll go deeper into some of the chemistry going on inside the coffee bean during the process. We'll cover what roasters are really trying to say when they use light, medium and dark on their bags. We'll get into the different kinds of machines that specialty coffee companies use to roast their coffee, and we'll also talk about the processes they go through to keep it tasting great every single day. Before we get into that, we should begin where this whole journey begins, with raw coffee. So this is raw coffee. This is the seeds, the dried seeds of the coffee tree. And right now it smells and tastes, well, pretty terrible. It doesn't smell of much at all. It smells kind of like, well, plant seeds a little bit, because that's what it is. All of the flavor happens in that process of transformation inside the roasting machine. And it is an astonishing process of transformation. You would never think, looking at these, potentially tasting these, that they were capable of so much flavor and so much complexity, but as we're going to explore today, they absolutely are. Now, it's the roasting process that creates those kind of familiar coffee flavors that we all enjoy. And when we talk about the roasting process, we often simplify it down to 3 characteristics that change in the process as we roast the coffee. And the first one is bitterness. The longer we roast the coffee, the darker the color of it will be, and a little bit like caramel, a darker caramel will also taste much more bitter. So there's an increase in bitterness during the roasting process. The second characteristic we often simplify is acidity. Now that actually increases initially and then has a little bit of a bell curve and then begins to decrease the darker the roast gets. For this reason, a lot of people prefer darker roasted coffee. It doesn't have the acidity that they don't particularly enjoy. However, it's rare to find dark roasted coffees in the specialty coffee world, and that's because of the third characteristic we need to talk about, which is difficult to talk about without sounding a little bit pretentious, and that is origin characteristics. Where you grow coffee, be it soil type, climate, altitude, or even how you process it after harvesting, well, all of that will have an impact on the kind of chemistry inside the seed. And when you roast it, well, different coffees will produce different flavors. We'll call this origin characteristic. And initially, when you roast a coffee, you do create those flavors. You can only create them based on what's there, but there's a process of creation initially. Then, however, the longer you roast the coffee, the less of those distinct, unique characteristics that belong to that particular coffee remain. And you get more and more of what we call a kind of generic roast taste. Put another way, darker roasted coffees ultimately end up tasting much more similar. And because specialty coffee is so interested in unique characteristics, that's why you tend to see lighter roasts that also happen to have more acidity in them. But this is a simplification of the process. Let's go a layer deeper. What we'll do now is we'll just follow along the roasting process from raw all the way through to a pretty dark roast. So what we're going to show you is a couple of angles of the roasting machine running, and what we'll also do is pull out a sample every minute or so initially for the first 5 or 6 minutes, and then every 30 seconds after that as the roast progresses, so that we can see the color changes happening. Now initially, not a lot happens. You'll see that the green coffee remains green for a little while. Green coffee has quite a lot of moisture in it, and what the roasting machine needs to do first is essentially dry it out. It's really hard to have those browning reactions take place with moisture present. It kind of limits your temperatures. Once that coffee has gotten, dried out, you'll see the color changes from green, it gets kind of paler, and then relatively quickly will begin to yellow. And we're at the very beginnings of those kind of browning flavors. Now, this roasting chemistry, as it progresses, does some really interesting stuff. Firstly, all of that water that hasn't escaped is turning to steam and is building up pressure. And then other roasting chemistry is causing gases to form, gases like CO2, but we'll see a lot more of that later. And you build up pressure inside the coffee bean. And a really key moment in the roasting process is called first crack. Because at some point, relatively early on, that pressure becomes too much and the gas escapes from the coffee bean, causing it to crack open. And you can literally see those cracks, but more interestingly, you can hear them. It sounds a little bit like popcorn. But it isn't like popcorn, it doesn't swell in size, it just lets the gas out. As a roaster, you're paying attention to when this happens in your roasting process. And from this point onwards, the browning reactions are really underway. And those are so complex and so rapid that this is a point from now on where you're really paying a lot of attention. Those color changes are relatively minor, but the flavor changes happening now are actually surprisingly large. Historically, roasters just looked at the color of the coffee beans. We'll talk about why they don't do that anymore, but ultimately these shifts aren't very visible, but they are big changes in flavor. Big changes in acidity and sweetness and bitterness are happening right now. At this point, you could probably take the coffee out and drink it and enjoy it. Depending on your vision as a roaster on how you like coffee to taste, the coffee may roast a little bit longer. At this point, everything is drinkable and good. So as the roast progresses, those beans will begin to get a little bit darker. They'll also get a little less wrinkly and a little bit more even looking as they get darker. They'll kind of smooth out. But as we continue to progress, well, we get towards dark roasts, and what will happen is there'll be another release of gases later on, and that's called second crack. Here, you'll see that the beans are really pretty smooth, a much darker brown, and the beginnings of oil on the surface of the bean. That's happening because of those pressures inside the bean forcing the oil to the surface, and the coffee bean itself is much more porous. It's actually swelling and growing in volume, decreasing in density. Now, you can keep roasting and you can keep roasting, you can keep roasting, you'll generate more and more of that bitterness. At this point, acidity is really pretty low, origin characteristics is really pretty low, and bitterness is going up and up and up. You might also see an increase in texture and in kind of body and mouthfeel when you brew that coffee. But after, in this case, I think 17, 18 minutes of roasting, we're going to call it a day here. However, people do roast darker than this. For me, though, this was dark enough to show you what I wanted to show you. So what we've done is we've laid out some of the coffee from each of the samples here on the table so we can talk about roast levels and really what they mean. Now, we'll talk about specialty first, because I would say the kind of categorization of light, medium, dark is a little different between specialty and commercial. Specialty would start, I would say, around here, really pretty light, and it would run probably to around here. So anything within this could be classified as a light roast. Medium would run from this point up until maybe here. The minute I see any sort of oil of any kind on the surface, I would say you've crossed into a dark roast. And from here onwards, it's a dark roast. It's rare for specialty to be at this end of dark roasting, but it's not unusual to see coffees roasted this way. Commercials are a little bit different. I would say the light starts about the same, but probably runs a little bit further in. Then medium would start here and run again a little bit further in. And then after that, dark roasted. They'll also roast darker than we have done here. I don't think it tastes great from a specialty perspective, but some people still do enjoy very darkly roasted coffee. At some point it just turns to carbon and then catches fire. I don't recommend that, but darker roasts are certainly possible. But the colour alone does not tell you everything. To understand that a bit more deeply, we need to talk about what's called a roast profile. Now, if you wanted to roast coffee at home, you could certainly get a sheet tray and pour out some raw coffee on it, pop it in an oven at 200 degrees Celsius, and it will roast in there, it will go brown. If you look at the roast profile, you'll see that the temperature of the coffee would increase and it would begin to slow the closer it gets to the target temperature. When you take it out, though, that's not going to be the best tasting coffee for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, where the coffee beans have been touching the metal the whole time, well, they'll have had a lot more conduction heat transfer and they're probably going to be a little bit burnt around those spots. And secondly, you don't necessarily want to have one constant temperature that the coffee is trying to reach. What we've learned through coffee roasting is actually you want to vary the amount of heat coming into the roaster and change it to change the rate at which the coffee is turning brown.
So this brings us to what roasters are talking about when they talk about a coffee roast profile. Now, machines themselves can often be very old, they can be sometimes very new. Regardless, they're all using multiple temperature probes positioned around the roaster to collect data and feed it into some sort of computer software. What that's ultimately going to track is the temperature of the bean probe. That's our closest guess to the temperature of the beans themselves during the roast. Now, the journey of the beans, in terms of how quickly they get hot, it will change depending on the coffee and what you want it to taste like. It might be that this phase here in the middle, as it's heating up, if it heats up quicker or if it heats up slower, well, that would change the flavor. And through a period of trial and error, and ultimately then knowledge that's passed around within the industry, you learn to create a roast profile for a particular coffee, usually on a particular machine. So it's not something you can take from one person's roaster and apply to another person's roaster, which is kind of confusing. Now, here on the screen, you can see a few things going on and quite a lot of data. And for most people, it's kind of overwhelming. But ultimately, this probe here is the bean temperature probe, and you can see the journey that it goes through. And you'll see that generally it's heating up pretty quickly. Here it slows and continues to slow, and towards the end, slows even more. That's not absolutely universal, but it is extremely common. And during the roast, roasters are making small changes to the amount of heat coming out of the burner, or in some cases the amount of air flowing through the drum, to change how much heat is being transferred to the coffee itself. And that's how you create a roast profile.
Roasters aren't aiming for one perfect profile, but they are aiming for consistency in their roasts. And I want to talk just briefly about how they approach that. Now, the first most obvious thing to do is to taste the coffee that you roast. And most roasters will be tasting everything that they roast. But there is a problem. Modern expectations say that the consumer wants their coffee roasted, bagged, and shipped the same day so that it is as fresh as possible. And this means really functional tasting is difficult to do before the coffee goes out the door. So they're looking for other ways, other checks that the coffee can pass or fail to hit to make sure that what they bag up and ship is tasting the way that they want it to. There's really three ways, and the first way we've kind of touched upon, that's the roast profile. The coffee should have followed the desired lines during the roast in order to pass that at the start. But some roasters will have higher tolerances than others there, and there are still other ways to check if things have gone as planned. Another common thing is what's called roast loss. Now, when you roast coffee, it loses weight. You might start with 10 kilos of coffee, and anywhere from maybe 13 through to 22, 23% of it may be lost during the roasting process. Most of that is water, but the darker you roast coffee, the more stuff breaks down and disappears. It doesn't tell you that much, but if you're expecting 14.5% roast loss and you get 15%, that should be a red flag that things haven't gone as expected. And the third one that again is very common is color testing. This is using some sort of machine that kind of measures brownness, how light, how dark the coffee is. Most roasters will grind a sample after roasting of every single batch and test the color using one of a variety of meters that do this. The most popular one, or the most commonly talked about one, is one called Agtron, and sometimes you'll even see companies publishing the Agtron numbers of their coffees to give you some indication of how light or dark that is. I'm not sure that's very useful. It's really a good solid internal measurement. As we talked about with roast profiling, the color alone doesn't tell you all that much, but it's definitely going to be a problem if that color is too dark or too light. And again, roasters will have some variance, some allowance within that color measurement, a kind of window of tasty. And those are the primary ways in which roasters QC coffee. Now, one thing I want to talk about here is what roasters mean when they talk about a coffee being roasted for filter coffee or having the word espresso on the label, implying that it's roasted in a way that should be brewed as espresso. Espresso is a difficult brew method. It doesn't use much water, it's very intense, it's very quick, and what roasters typically try and do is roast the coffee in a way that it's easier to extract. That might be they roast it a touch darker in color. It might be that the whole profile takes a little bit longer. They slow the roast down, and there's variations within that, but that's what espresso on the label means. It's typically a more soluble roast than it would be for a filter coffee, because it's easier to properly brew coffee when you brew it as a filter coffee. You've got a lot more time, and you've actually got a lot more water to do the extraction work with. Now, you don't have to brew espresso labeled coffees in an espresso machine. You could brew it in a mocha pot. You could make it in a pour over and probably enjoy it still, but that's what roasters are trying to communicate with that language on the label. Let's talk now about how these roasting machines actually work. So first up, I want to talk about a type of machine called a drum roaster. And it's called that because in the middle of this thing is a big spinning drum. It's like a kind of giant tumble dryer. Now, the way that these work is that you have underneath here a heat source. Typically it's a gas burner, and that's going to heat two things. By proximity, it's actually going to heat the big metal drum, typically made of cast iron, but primarily it's going to heat air. Now that air is being pulled through the back of the drum, through the coffee and out, and it'll run from here through this fan that's doing all of that work, and it'll be pushed out of the exhaust and away, typically in larger roasters to be burnt to get rid of any smoke in what's called an afterburner. Drum roasters are interesting. They're probably the most common type of roaster used in specialty coffee companies, and they heat coffee slightly differently. They heat coffee three ways. Primarily, it's convection. It's the hot air flowing through the coffee beans. But because the drum is hot, there is some conduction heat, a little bit like a steak in a frying pan. Like that touch of the bean onto a hot surface does have some heat transfer. In addition, because that drum is hot, there's also radiant heat kind of emanating from the metal into the coffee, but primarily it's going to be the convection of the air going through it. It does produce a different kind of flavor, conventional wisdom says, to other kinds of roasters, but I don't know how true that really is. There's a lot of different ways to use a drum roaster, and you can get a lot of very different results from it. Now, the roaster operating the machine is going to be paying a lot of attention to the probe data coming from it to decide when to make changes to the gas going to the burners. But at a very specific endpoint, a combination of time, temperature, and color, the coffee very quickly needs to
stop roasting and to be cooled down, and pretty much every roaster will use some sort of cooling tray. Now, when the coffee leaves the roasting machine, it's often in excess of 200 degrees Celsius, and I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's very hot, and we need to make it as close to room temperature as possible, as quickly as possible, to stop the roasting process. Now, most machines will use air to do that. The coffee will tumble into a tray like this one, arms will stir it and mix it as a very large fan pulls air from the room down through it to cool it down very quickly. Now, larger machines, or machines with slightly smaller cooling trays, sometimes need to use a different process called quenching. Here, a very, very small amount of water is sprayed onto the coffee beans. That water instantly evaporates because the beans are so hot, and the evaporative cooling really very quickly cools the beans down. Now, there's no real downsides to quenching except that that coffee will need a little bit less rest before cooling, and it will stale slightly quicker, but quenching does not impact the quality of the coffee whatsoever. Cooling done, let's talk about a different sort of roasting machine. There is another type of roasting machine. It's called a hot air roaster, a little bit different to a drum machine. Here you've got a big heat source, and that's separate to the machine, and it produces, alongside a blower, vast amounts of hot air that flow into the machine, and the hot air is not only going to roast the coffee, but it's going to do all of the agitation as well. So when you look inside these, you can see the coffee being thrown around, churned and moved just by the volume of air flowing through it. That means there's no real moving parts in the roaster the way there are inside a drum roaster. But just the same, you're going to vary the intensity of the heat, but here you can also vary the volume of air flowing through it. There's no better roaster out there in the world than any other. There's simply a tool for a roaster to create the flavor profile that they like. And for some roasters, they prefer the style of coffee you get from an air roaster that is a little bit different to drum roasters. And then there's a third type of roaster, a kind of hybrid air roaster. Here, you still have a drum that rotates to tumble the coffee, but like an air roaster, the heat source is separate, so it's really just heating the air. The drum itself does not get hot. Some people say these can be much more efficient. Others like the fact that the drum doesn't kind of have any conduction heat into the coffee. Again, roasters are just tools to make the coffee that you want to make. And that is the basics of coffee roasting. And now I want to hear from you down in the comments below. What aspect of this do you want to know more about? Should we go deeper into in the future? Has this been helpful in how you think about coffee? Has it been eye-opening? Let me know your thoughts. I'd really appreciate it. Now, I will say some of you are going to ask a question, and that question is, when are you going to make a bunch of videos about roasting coffee at home? I don't know, but I will tell you that I definitely want to make those videos. They are in the master plan, the big what we will do in the future. I just don't know when. All right, enough caveats from me. I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Welcome to another episode in the Beginner's Guide to Coffee, and today we're covering espresso-based drinks. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to give you an exact recipe for all of the 15 different drinks that we're going to cover. That would take a really long time. Instead, I'm going to give you a little bit of the history, the kind of idea behind the drink, so that you know what to order, what you might expect when you do, and what you might want to make at home. So, first on the list, let's talk about espresso. Espresso is now incredibly difficult to actually define. It is basically a small, strong coffee brewed under pressure, typically topped with a red-brown foam called crema. That seems a little wishy-washy, but there's loads of different ways to make espresso these days. Now, the Italian National Espresso Institute, which of course exists, and I'm very happy it does have a very precise definition for Italian espresso. And I'll show that to you here. When you talk about espresso, especially online, there's a bit of a confusion between what is a single and what is a double. Because here we've got, say, 7 grams of coffee for a single espresso, but often you'll see recipes for 14, 18, 16, 20 grams of coffee. That's because they're brewing inside a double basket and not a single basket, so they're basically brewing 2 shots of espresso, a double espresso. Now you'll see Italian espresso talks about milliliters in the cup, it's a volume measurement, whereas modern espresso talks about grams in the cup. And if you have grams in the cup and how many grams of coffee that you used, you have what are called ratios, so the ratio between ground coffee and liquid coffee. A traditional espresso is in the 1 to 2 to 1 to 3 range, right? So that's how much liquid you typically produce in around 25 to 30 seconds typically under, say, 6 to 9 bars of pressure at a brew temperature between 88 and probably 96, 97 degrees Celsius. I don't want to be overly prescriptive about what it is because it can and should be lots of different things, but that ratio will give you a pretty good idea of what to expect from a traditional espresso. And as I said, modern coffee shops typically serve you a double espresso as standard. Traditional coffee shops will typically serve you a single espresso as standard. Now, one quick note, if you're in Italy, you'll probably notice that no one really orders un espresso at the bar. They say un caffè, right? They just say a coffee. That is the default way of brewing coffee in Italy. So if you order a coffee, you get espresso. A common variation on an espresso is a ristretto. The name means restricted and the flow is restricted. And the idea is from the same amount of ground coffee, you get less liquid. And that liquid will be more intense, thicker, oozier, more kind of textured than a normal espresso. The easy way to do that is just to cut the shot short and let less liquid flow through the coffee. The better way to do it is to grind a little finer so the whole flow is slower and you're able to properly extract the coffee using less water. But in terms of ratios, a ristretto would be say 1 to 1 or say 1 to 1.5. That would be, broadly speaking, the definition of a ristretto. Increasingly popular in modern coffee shops is the lungo. It just means a long coffee. Here, the ratio is much higher. Typically, it's not just a case of pushing more water through the same puck that you would brew an espresso with. Here, you'd be grinding coarser and allowing a lot more liquid to flow in a kind of similar brew time. Here, the ratio might be, say, 1 to 3, up to 1 to 5, 1 to 6. And that's kind of the limits, really, of a traditional lungo. Next up is espresso con panna. Now this is a drink more commonly seen outside of Italy than inside of Italy. It's not a traditional drink necessarily. Here it's just an espresso topped with a little whipped cream or double cream. It's also more commonly seen served with darker roasts where you'd want to buffer a bit of that bitterness with the cream. It's not typically served with lighter roasted, more modern style specialty coffees. The macchiato is a complicated drink these days. But it shouldn't be. The name means marked or stained, and I think its history most likely goes back to a traditional espresso bar in Italy. There, lots of coffees would be served, you'd kind of order your drink, pick up something that was served on the bar sort of separately. Here, if you wanted just a little bit of milk in your espresso, which is kind of what the drink is, then that would happen. But because of the crema on an espresso, if you pour just a little milk into a drink, you can't necessarily tell which one has just a splash of milk in it. So in order to tell which one was which, the barista would grab their jug of milk, grab a little teaspoon of foam, and dot the one that had a little milk in it with a dot of foam on top. So that way, when you walked up to the bar, you could see easily which one had a little milk in it. This was how it was served for a long time until really latte art became incredibly popular. And at that point, a macchiato became an entirely different drink because baristas wanted to flex a little bit and pour nice looking patterns in espresso cups because it's hard to do and it looks quite cool. So the drink has more recently shifted, and a modern macchiato is a kind of 1-to-1 of espresso and milk, steamed milk with a thin layer of foam on top. However, we should mention the caramel macchiato, which Starbucks has used to confuse almost everyone, where you have a kind of latte drizzled or marked with caramel, and I think that has caused a great deal of confusion over the last 10 or 15 years in many, many coffee shops. Espresso Romano, Roman espresso I guess, is served very simply. It is a shot of espresso with some lemon in some form. Now you see it served either as a twist of lemon or as a little slice of lemon. I would say with lighter kind of modern specialty coffees I would avoid the lemon slice and I would go for a lemon twist because you're adding quite a lot of acidity to an already quite acidic beverage. But with a darker roast, that little lemon slice might contribute just a little lift in acidity and be really quite pleasant. The cortado is another drink that's gotten a little bit confusing. It is, historically speaking, a Spanish or Portuguese drink. It's most commonly seen there. And it is a 1-to-1 of espresso and steamed milk. These days, it's become a little bit like the sort of macchiato in that it's a full cup, so the barista can pour latte art, and it can be anywhere from a 1-to-1 ratio of coffee to milk to a 1-to-3 in some cases too. This is definitely a drink where the modern specialty shop and the traditional style one are quite a long way apart, and there's a huge amount of variance in the strength or size of drinks that you will receive, especially in modern coffee shops. In a very similar vein is the piccolo latte. The name, despite being an Italian name, probably doesn't originate in Italy itself. It was probably Italianized outside of Italy because it's not a drink you really ever see there. It's a smaller latte. Typically it's a single shot of espresso and the ratio is 1:2 to maybe 1:3, sometimes 1:4. It crosses over with the cortado in many specialty coffee shops where one shop's cortado is identical to another shop's piccolo. That can be a little bit confusing, but that's roughly the idea behind it. It's a small latte. The story you most often hear about the Americano is that after World War II, American soldiers stationed in Italy couldn't handle espresso and so would ask for it to be watered down a little bit to be more like American coffee. And thus was born the Americano. It's probably not true. Modern espresso wasn't really invented until 1948 and took a couple of years to really gain popularity after that. Ultimately, the idea is right though. This is a way of making espresso close to American-style filter coffee in strength. And to do that, you use hot water to dilute down the espresso. These days that ratio will go from anywhere from 1:3 to 1:4 to 1:5. It's pretty open in that regard, and typically a specialty shop will put the hot water in the cup first and pull the espresso on top. The order you do them in doesn't actually make any real difference, it just looks much prettier to do water first and then coffee on top. Now the long black is a little bit different to an Americano because of the culture that it came from. This is a drink that came out of Australia and New Zealand. And as that culture spread, as that style of espresso brewing spread, they were brewing a lot of up-dosed, so a lot of coffee in the portafilter, ristretto style espressos. And that was being used in a long black. So it's a little different from an Americano because traditionally, typically, it's a double ristretto on top of hot water. It's a stronger, slightly more textured drink than an Americano, but often there's not all that much difference in it. The cappuccino is super interesting to me because it has such an interesting history. In fact, I made a whole video about its history. But ultimately the drink predates espresso. It goes all the way back to Vienna and it was called ein Cappuccino. And here you used coffee and milk and you mixed them to the colour of the Capuchin monks' robes. That was how you described how milky, how strong you wanted your coffee. Since then it's changed a great deal and a modern cappuccino is defined in a couple of ways. Firstly, it should be a relatively strong drink. You might see a ratio of 1:3 to 1:5 in terms of espresso to milk, and it should have a thick layer of foam on top. Ideally that foam should be microfoam where our bubbles are so small that you can barely see them, and it's a delicious, lovely drink. Now there is the old rule of thirds for a cappuccino that doesn't really make any sense. That is 1 part espresso, 1 part steamed milk, and 1 part milk foam. Now that means if you had a single shot of Italian espresso at 25 mils, then your single shot cappuccino would be a 75 ml drink, which it's not. So the cafe latte is interesting. It's another drink that evolved, I think, outside of Italy despite having an Italian name. You don't really see it very often in Italy. Its history or its roots might be something like the café au lait, the French drink where you'd have quite strong coffee and equal parts of that and hot milk, often served in a bowl. Dip your little pastry in there, very delicious. But the cafe latte, the modern cafe latte, is defined by being a relatively weak drink. The ratio of milk to coffee is a little bit higher and it will have some foam on the drink, but not a lot. This means it's very popular for people who like a sweeter, milkier thing, and popular with baristas who can pour really nice latte art into it. Ratio-wise, it will vary quite a lot. It can go from, say, 1:4 up to 1:6 in some cases. Often it's served as a larger drink with a double shot in the base. The history of the flat white is extremely contentious. Those from Australia argue that it's Australian, those from New Zealand would say it's from New Zealand. It most likely originated as a kind of pushback against the big, awful, dry, sea-foamy cappuccino of the 1990s. People didn't want a cup that was mostly air, they just wanted a flat, white coffee. That was it. Just give me not the big foamy thing, but a milky coffee. And these days, a flat white is very common, especially in Europe, especially in the UK actually, in a lot of specialty shops. It would be defined as a small, strong latte, in that it's typically a double shot drink in, say, a 5 or 6 ounce cup or a 150 to 180 ml cup, with the textured milk similar to a latte, so a thin layer of foam on top. Again, commonly poured with latte art, because you've got that really thin, silky texture of milk that lets you pour quite intricate, delicate patterns with it. While it has been adopted by some larger chain coffee companies, if you see it in a specialty independent shop, chances are there's a bit of an Antipodean influence there and you'll probably get pretty good coffee. Caffè corretto is a kind of great name for this drink. It means a corrected coffee, and it's corrected by adding some booze to it. This is often served as an espresso with a little booze on the side. Sometimes the booze is in the coffee already, but what I most commonly see, especially in Italy, is that people will drink the espresso, nearly finish it, and then throw in the booze, swirl it around, and sort of capture the last of the coffee, mix it with the alcohol, and drink it that way. As for alcohol, most often it's seen with grappa, sometimes sambuca, occasionally cognac if someone's feeling fancy, but those would be the main types of booze that you'd see in a cafe corretto. Historically, the word mocha kind of existed in and around coffee when it was referencing the port of Mocha in Yemen. Coffee from that part of the world was often labelled as mocha, and what became popular at one point in the industry were mocha Java blends. Theoretically, blends of coffees from Yemen with coffees from Java. Now, this became a kind of stylistic thing, a kind of idea rather than a traceability thing, and people began to put other coffees in their mocha Java blends just to aim for that kind of chocolatier, heavier taste profile. How that connects to a hot chocolate with some espresso in it, I don't really know, but that seems to be the kind of rough source of the link. As for the drink itself, it really is pretty variable out there how it's done. People might use sort of couverture, sort of melted chocolate. They might use a chocolate syrup. There are no hard and fast rules. You might even see powdered chocolate in there in some cafes too. It is ultimately a hot chocolate with a single or double shot of espresso, but there's really very little in the way of rules around what a mocha is. In some cases, it might have some whipped cream on top. So the red eye is really a drink that I've only ever seen in North America, and it obviously references someone being extremely tired, the same way you might take a red eye flight overnight and, you know, arrive first thing in the morning and feel pretty terrible and need some coffee to pick you up. It's basically a filter coffee with an espresso dropped in it just to give it some more strength and more caffeine. Personally, I would separate the two and enjoy an espresso and then take my filter coffee with me, but if you're in a hurry, I guess, just throw it all together, have some fun. Now, the breve latte is another kind of variation that I typically only see in North America. It refers to a cafe latte. Instead of using milk, you're using half and half, which, if you're not familiar with it, is half whole milk and half single cream, so a notably higher fat content than whole milk. That's basically it. It's the same ratios you'd aim for, I guess, the same texture, though half and half won't foam identically to whole milk, so you'll have a slight variance in sort of foam texture there. It is a milky, kind of fattier, richer version of a cafe latte. Last up, I want to talk about the Gibraltar. Now, this is actually quite a popular drink, but quite a confusing drink. It originates most likely in San Francisco, most likely in Blue Bottle. It's a drink that's named after the name of the glass made by a company called Libby. They make a particular glass called the Gibraltar glass. And if you had coffee and milk in that, it was a kind of 1-to-2 kind of ratio drink. It was quite a strong milk drink, a little bit of foam on top. That was a Gibraltar. And that's kind of gotten out, and it's not always served in a Libby-made Gibraltar glass, but that's roughly the idea behind it. This happens once in a blue moon where a cafe kind of names a drink and it kind of leaks out into the rest of the world. It's kind of interesting. Ultimately, if you're ordering a Gibraltar somewhere else, you're really probably ordering a piccolo latte or a cortado in some places too. It's really within that kind of family of drinks, but it did seem worth mentioning in this video. But now I really want to hear from you down in the comments below. Did I miss a drink out? I know I didn't put the affogato in, but that's because it's really a dessert, not a drink. Maybe there's a definition that you disagree with. I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a comment, let me know your thoughts. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.
My favorite part about the EK is that it's big enough to give you a hug. You know, if you've ever carried one and you felt it hold you back. No, I'm kidding.
That's great.
My name is Elizabeth Johnson. I live in Los Angeles, California, and I work for Dayglow Coffee. I'm the director of operations for our Los Angeles stores, and I do education for all of Dayglow. I think the most rewarding part of working in coffee is the coffee culture and the people and the community that you make. I think anybody who's been in the industry for long enough probably stays in the industry for the people that they've met and the connections that they've made. I haven't seen another industry that works quite like it. When I first started working in coffee, I was definitely very passionate about the craft, and I really wanted to learn everything that I could about brewing coffee, extracting espresso, latte art, and being the best that I could be at what I was making. I've been competing in the United States Barista Championships for 5 years. I've done cup tasters, kind of dipped my toe in Brewer's Cup. I still care about all those things and I feel passionately about them. But I think that I care a lot more about nurturing the people who are newer in coffee. I've kind of made it my mission to share anything and everything I have with people who are looking for ways to grow in coffee. Early in coffee, it was like I would go to coffee shops and look in the window and see who had an EK, and that's where I would go get coffee because I figured if they had that grinder, they were doing something right. I've seen a lot of other grinders come out, but nothing that I think truly compares to the EK, just in consistency, reliability, the end result that you get from brewing with the EK. It's been my favorite grinder as long as I've been using it, and I'm very loyal to the EK. There's so many good things about the EK43, but name one bad thing. Like, there's literally nothing wrong with it. I've never found a flaw or said, oh, I wish this was different about that grinder. I think all my experiences have been really positive, and that's why I think it's such an icon.
We're all a little judgy in the industry, but you know, you kind of go into a cafe for the first time, you're looking around and you're kind of trying to see what kind of cafe they are. You know, there's certain markers where you walk in and you see it and you're like, okay, cool. I think the EK is one of those things, and that's part of like how it is iconic and how it is a staple in the industry, is that it's something recognizable. My name is Erica Escalante, and I am the Director of Operations for Good Boy Bob Coffee Roasters. I love the LA coffee scene, I think because it's just so big. I have so many friends here, and all of my friends basically work in coffee, which I really don't mind because you have a really large group of people who believe in hospitality and kindness and service. And those people are all of my closest friends. They're so loving and so just willing and able to help people around them. I think something really amazing about this industry, we've all worked towards just being more inclusive. When I first started, I never saw people in positions of power that looked like me. You know, we are seeing women winning competitions. We are seeing non-binary and trans people in positions of power, and lots of people of color doing their own things. I think there's more work to be done, of course, but it's just such an amazing time to be in the industry now and just see all the progress that has been made. My amazing partner also works in this industry. It's not uncommon that we're doing cuppings at home and explaining coffee to our kids. And my kids were raised in my cafes. They were born into it. And I have no doubt that we have a community to embrace them and love them and help raise them as well. And that's just how coffee people are. We as a company put out 2 rare coffees every single month, and these coffees are some of the most incredible coffees in the world. They have such incredible stories behind them. They are so precious to us, and so putting those in that EK, it's just like peace of mind, you know? Like, we know that the grind is going to be solid. It's like the perfect type of grinder to have for these super special things that we care about and that we really, really love.
People sometimes they take a look to see what espresso machine there is, what grinders people have, you know. And when people see that EK43, they're like, oh, okay. They got some. Yeah. When you talk about coffee cities now, you can't not mention Los Angeles. This is my 15th year living in Los Angeles, making coffee in the Venice area. I've always wanted to continue fostering community, and to have had Venice to do that for has been a gift, a privilege, a blessing. It's made, you know, this home. There's 17 million visitors, you know, just up and down one of the streets here a year. And so a coffee shop is a perfect place for a lot of those communities to blend together. My name is Christopher Nicely Abel Alameda. Most folks in the industry call me Nicely. I'm currently sitting in Venice, California at my coffee bar, Hooked. We specialize in natural processed coffees along with natural wines. Community has been the driving force for everything I think ultimately gravitated towards when it comes to coffee. Family, friends, patrons has all come together. That kinship, that worldwide, we're all looking to achieve something, you know, simple as it may be, in making someone's day with a cup of coffee. But when we choose to execute at a high level and deliver on a level of quality that's unmatched, you know, yeah, we look, you know, for the right things that are gonna propel our service forward. Geeks love to geek, and so we love talking the gear. We love understanding what helps us deliver on a promise that when we say something is gonna taste a certain way, it does. There's no mistake about it. When that EK43 is on your bar, it stands out in a way that's undeniable. Looks could be one thing, but again, performance is everything. I describe it like a chef having a really great knife, you know, nice and sharp. There's no mistake about it that there's no beating it.
We are people
living their profession
with passion.
We are global citizens
linked to our lands
and territories.
We search for innovation, respect the people
and environment.
We believe what we do can have an impact.
We embrace technology
in design
to deliver a better result.
We know that maximum
precision
and control
are what really makes a difference.
Taste matter.
Mythos remains the legend of creating excellence in coffee.
Since 2013,
it continues its destiny
of being a key partner
in expanding our passion.
And now we expand that partnership
to reach a new level
of pride.
Perfection.
Again.
Again.
Again. Again. Again.